Notre Dame versus Ohio State is a top 5 matchup that takes place in Columbus that pits Marcus Freeman, an Ohio State alum who played linebacker under Jim Tressel, against head coach Ryan Day, who's from New Hampshire, worked under Urban Meyer in 2018 as offensive coordinator before taking over as the head coach of the Ohio State University. This is a top 5 matchup. There's a lot of history between these two teams, especially in New Year's Six Bowls, where Ohio State has dominated Notre Dame. And there's history between the fact that Marcus Freeman is an Ohio State Buckeye in his playing career and is coaching against his former team in just a few days at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time on ABC. I'm excited for this matchup. Again, it's a top 5 matchup with Notre Dame being ranked number 5 and Ohio State being ranked number 2. If there's any background noise in this video, I apologize. I am recording this episode in a parking structure in the back of my 2001 Ford Explorer because I have class in a half hour or so and I want to get this episode out. So sorry for the delay of this episode and any potential background noise. But this is college football. It's what I love doing. This episode can't really afford to get out any sooner, so I'm just going to go ahead and do this. Thank you all again for just the support for this channel and for the awesome community that we have built. Let's go on to 7,000 subscribers, 8,000, 9,000, 10,000. Let's have a really fantastic college football season. Purdue versus Penn State is on at, I believe, 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. West Virginia and Pittsburgh is also on at that time, along with Central Michigan versus Oklahoma State. So there's college football tonight. I'll be watching it. I presume many of you will also be watching it as well. So just some games to keep in mind for tonight. Michigan State versus Western Michigan is on tomorrow. This game, of course, is on at Saturday. Without further ado, though, enough of my chit-chat. Let's start the preview of this game. Ohio State Buckeyes taking on the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. This is the highest-ranked matchup of Week 1. Oregon nearly in the top 10 versus Georgia, who's number 3. It doesn't even come close to Ohio State at number 2, Notre Dame at number 5. This is by far the highest-ranked matchup of Week 1. The game's at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time on ABC, and Ohio State is given a massive 83.5% chance to win this game. Michigan over Colorado State was 97.6%. So Ohio State is heavily favored to win here, according to ESPN's FPI, and a lot of bettors have the Buckeyes favored by 17 points, which is more than 2 touchdowns and 2 two-point conversions. Ohio State is a very heavy favorite here, and a lot of people have Notre Dame in their top 10. So what this goes to show is that the top 3 of the nation, not even the top 4 or top 5, the top 3 of the nation in Alabama, Ohio State, and Georgia, they are all in their own separate tier from even the 4th and 5th best team. The teams 1, 2, and 3 are up on Mount Everest, and then there is a cliff drop that takes place, goes down by a few miles, and that's where your number 4, 5, 6, and 7 teams are. Your top 3 are further separated from, I would argue, teams at least like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, then those respective 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 are further from the top 15. I'd argue teams number 15 and 10 are probably closer together than teams number 10 and number 5, or even than team number 6 is from number 3. That's just how separate the top 3 are from the rest of college football. In Alabama and Ohio State for sure. Georgia, there's a pretty good argument they're in that category as well. I'd lean toward them being more in that category than not. Again, pardon the background noise, but it is what it is. The Buckeyes are heavy favorites. It makes sense in my mind. Their staff is superior. Their quarterback is superior in CJ Stroud compared to Tyler Buckner, who's starting for the Irish. At running back, you have TreVeyon Henderson for Ohio State, and you have Tyree for the Irish. TreVeyon Henderson, Mayan Williams, that is a duo, is one of the best duos in the nation at running back, and they outmatch Chris Tyree by far. At wide receiver, you have Jaxon Smith-Njigba, Marvin Harrison Jr., Julian Fleming, and Emeka Egbuka for a loaded Ohio State wide receiver core. They're going to outmatch Notre Dame at that position by miles and miles. Pretty similar at quarterback. Running back, it's still a heavy lean for Ohio State. I'd say Ohio State in the areas which they're better in, listed here, there is a pretty heavy lean toward them. For Notre Dame, I'd lean pretty heavily toward them with tight end. They have Michael Mayer, who some would argue is the best tight end in the nation. There's certainly an argument for him to be number 2 tight end, if not a top 5 tight end in the nation. That's for sure. Notre Dame historically has had good tight ends. Ohio State here under Ryan Day, they had Jeremy Ruckert. And last year they really didn't utilize their tight ends in the receiving game, and their run and pass block were not up to the standard Ohio State standard that Buckeye fans and college football fans all know well and all, for the most part, love. So I would favor Notre Dame with Michael Mayer at tight end here. I think that also a matchup that we'll talk about later is Notre Dame's wide receivers. I don't think will be able to target Ohio State's defensive backs. I don't think that's a possibility. But at tight end, Michael Mayer versus whether it's Steele Chambers or Tommy Eichenberg, that's a mismatch that favors the Irish right there. It's a very heavy mismatch. Notre Dame being better at both tight end and linebacker. Michael Mayer, in my opinion, being much better and will win any matchup versus any Ohio State linebacker on the field. So something to watch that is in favor for once for the Irish. In trench play, Ohio State is more talented there by star talent, raw talent, and I think that they will be more talented there, period. Amen. This game. At offensive line, you have guys like Paris Johnson Jr., for example. Luke Weipler is the center for Ohio State. Have an argument to have one of the best offensive lines this season. Notre Dame, when they had Jarrett Patterson healthy, they also had an argument for this. Jarrett Patterson was an All-American, I believe, at the offensive line. He's injured. He's out for this game. I think I read somewhere he's out for the season, which really sucks. Notre Dame's offensive line and Ohio State's offensive line, they're pretty close, solid units, but with injuries and with just more raw talent, I'd favor Ohio State here. Especially, I would favor Ohio State here in the realm of pass block and in run block too, but especially in pass block. Defensive line, JT Tuimoloau, Jack Sawyer, Zach Harrison. At defensive tackle, you have Teron Vincent, at Jerron Cage. That right there alone, just especially the defensive ends I listed, is enough to convince anyone that Ohio State will have the better D-line here. Notre Dame's D-line, interestingly enough, is coached by Al Washington, who was fired from Ohio State last year. At linebacker, I think Notre Dame clears here with guys like Jack Kaiser. Going back to the D-line, though, you have Isaiah Foskey for Notre Dame, who will be interesting to look at. Defensive backs, Notre Dame is pretty thin at that position. They have Brandon Joseph, but Ohio State is Denzel Burke, who's one of the better corners in the nation, and guys like Tanner McAllister and Ronnie Hickman. For special teams, they have kicker Noah Ruggles, and they have a pretty solid special teams unit for the Buckeyes, too. Ohio State is ranked number 2 in the FPI, number 2 in the AP poll. I have them at number 1. Both teams went 11-2 last year. I personally, for all intents and purposes, think that Ohio State is the far superior team, and you can see that in my rank of Notre Dame. Many have Notre Dame in the top 10. The FPI has them at 5th. The AP poll and the FPI disagree a lot. A lot of rankings and then football power indexes constantly disagree. Here they don't, though. Here in the FPI and the AP poll, both teams are ranked the exact same place. Number 2 for the Buckeyes, number 5 for the Irish. Ohio State's football power index is miles higher than Notre Dame, despite them being separated by only 3 spots, which again links back to my argument and statement that the top 3 are just that much better than the rest. Like, Notre Dame is probably closer to Wisconsin in in talent and just an overall performance than they are to Ohio State, if we're being honest here. That's just how separate the top three. You could even expand it to top, I'd say 4, 5, 6. Maybe there's an argument to expand it to 10, but that isn't always the case. Some year there's only 3 really elite teams. Others there are a plethora. Notre Dame I do not think is that this year. I have them outside of my top 10. Their special teams unit looks to be a little rough. The injuries they sustained at wide receiver and O-line will limit them. They already have a pretty inexperienced quarterback room. They have Drew Pine, Tyler Buckner. At running back, they lost Kyron Williams last year, have to replace him with Chris Tyree. And I trust, funny enough, the offensive staff. I trust Tommy Rees as OC. What I don't trust is Al Golden as Notre Dame's defensive coordinator to carry on what Marcus Freeman had last year, and I don't trust Al Washington coaching the D-line. I think Notre Dame as a team, from departing talent, from incoming coaching staff and regime change, I think for this year has downgraded. I think Marcus Freeman he's a great recruiter. Only time will tell if he's a good coach. He's certainly a great recruiter, certainly an elite coordinator. Only time, though, will tell how good of a coach he is. Ohio State upgraded in just about every way, except for the departing talent at wide receiver core, and I think they're pretty darn close to reloading there. They returned CJ Stroud, TreVeyon Henderson, and Jaxon Smith-Njigba. They also returned Paris Johnson Jr. on that offensive line. They returned Zach Harrison at defensive end, freshman Denzel Burke at corner. They return a lot of critical guys. And Ryan Day, wide receivers coach Brian Hartline, O-line coach Justin Fry, they make up a great offensive staff, and there are others there too. And then at the defensive position, you have Jim Knowles, who's a great DC, linebackers coach too, Larry Johnson, and you have a really good staff for Ohio State this year, an elite staff. I think they can be one of the best staffs in the country, in fact. So Ohio State, a team who I have at number 1, facing off against Notre Dame, who I have as just barely a top 15 team. You can see where this is going here. Some players to watch would be quarterback CJ Stroud. CJ Stroud, it is, I will admit, almost the easy answer to give him as a player to watch, but it's the necessary answer, because Notre Dame's front 7 is going to have much better talent than Notre Dame's secondary. Notre Dame's front 7, Isaiah Foskey, Jack Kaiser, they have much more depth. They don't have the same question marks that they do at secondary, and Ohio State's pass game is much better than its run game. They have a good run game, believe me, but by pass blocking concerns, receiving concerns, the quarterback, those concerns don't exist. Last year, Ohio State was a better team, from what I could tell. They were a better team at passing the ball, including the offensive line in their pass block, than they were running the football. I think that's going to be pretty similar yet again this year, because the talent at wide receiver, Brian Hartline's factored into that as the best wide receivers coach in the country, and CJ Stroud just evolving as a player and getting better and better. CJ Stroud passed for 4,435 yards this past season, 44 touchdowns, only had 6 interceptions, and had the number 1 QB rating in the country with a 91.6. He also had the number 2 passer rating in the country with a 186.6. Watch out for Stroud. He is going to, I think, tear apart the Notre Dame secondary, in my opinion. And if he doesn't, well, he'll certainly have the potential to, and Notre Dame's secondary will be better than I anticipated. But with Jaxon Smith-Njigba, Marvin Harrison Jr., Emeka Egbuka, Julian Fleming, CJ Stroud already has the weapons and the protection to do well, and when his supporting cast does well, he passes for anywhere from 350 to 500 yards and several touchdowns. He has the arm talent, the intelligence, even the mobility. He can scramble if needed. He is going to be the player of the game, in my opinion, for Ohio State, the player to watch. For Notre Dame, it's Isaiah Foskey. Isaiah Foskey, 38 solo tackles last year, 11 sacks, 52 total tackles, 6 forced fumbles, 2 of them recovered, 1 pass defended. Listen, Aiden Hutchinson, David Ojabo. How was Michigan able to beat Ohio State last year? They were able to beat Ohio State pass rush. Pass rush, pass rush, pass rush. And they got to CJ Stroud. They sacked him 4 times, and when they didn't sack him, they would pressure him, sometimes out of his mind into making questionable decisions. They made him flinch. If Notre Dame and Michigan are very similar. Brian Kelly and Jim Harbaugh era. They're more defensive teams. They're typically good at trench play on both the offensive line and defensive lines, and they like to run the football. If Notre Dame is going to beat Ohio State, Isaiah Foskey is going to have a huge game. He's going to have a huge presence on that D-line and he's going to have to abuse whatever tackle he faces. He's going to have to absolutely abuse the tackle he faces. And there's probably going to have to be another, whether it's a linebacker who's used in pressure or another defensive lineman who will have to step up with Isaiah Foskey, because Ohio State's O-line is talented enough to where one guy who is great at getting pressure isn't always enough to spread terror throughout the Ohio State offense. Michigan State, for example, last year at Jacob Panashuk, he did nothing in the game against Ohio State. Penn State had Arnold Ebiketie, and he did something, but the pass rush still wasn't effective enough to shut down the Buckeyes. Nebraska had Garrett Nelson, and they couldn't do enough. You need more than one great pass rusher to make Ohio State flinch and make them question their offensive game plan. Isaiah Foskey, he's a very good defensive end. Very close to elite defensive end. So he might be able to do this on his own, but he's going to have someone else to help him. But he's going to be the main story if the D-line and the linebacker core for Notre Dame can limit Ohio State's offense and get pressure on the quarterback. If Notre Dame wins this game, it will be because of defense. It will also be because if they do win this game, they'll be able to run effectively on Ohio State, but more importantly, get pressure on Stroud and shut down that offense. So those are some players to watch. CJ Stroud for Ohio State, Isaiah Foskey for Notre Dame. My prediction here, Ohio State is a massive talent edge, and this is going to only help them. It'll only help them. And CJ Stroud and JSN are going to have a field day with that talent edge. And this talent edge does not just include the offense, it includes the defense. There's an argument that Jim Knowles coming in, he might basically do nothing in year one because his scheme is complex and it takes time to develop. But here's the thing. At Oklahoma State, Jim Knowles did not have 4 and 5 stars to work with on defense. He has endless of those to work on defense, and I do think the D will be tested. And by tested, I don't mean they'll fail the test. I mean Notre Dame is one of the better teams Ohio State's going to face all year, even offensively, because the Big Ten is not a very innovative league offensively. They're not the Big 12. They're not even the Pac-12. Big Ten's defense and trench play, and Notre Dame's going to have definitely one of the top 4th of offenses that Ohio State faces all year. Only Michigan's offense and probably Michigan State's and maybe another team that I'm forgetting will overall be better and more suited to face Ohio State's defense than Notre Dame's will be, because Ohio State facing Iowa, Wisconsin, Indiana, Rutgers, those teams, they're not going to have better offenses than Notre Dame. They're just not going to. So the D will be tested, but I think Jim Knowles, with the talent he has, the defense will improve. Notre Dame's offense, with injuries at wide receiver and offensive lineman Jarrett Patterson being out, their offense will be more limited. It won't be as efficient as it would be if fully healthy, which is the case with any team. So injuries play in favor of Ohio State. Talent plays in favor. The quarterback and passing game do. Even the trench play and run game do. Almost everything plays into Ohio State's hands here, assuming that the defense is going to improve. There are assumptions, of course, because it's a week 1 game. We don't exactly know what's going to happen. But Ohio State should win this game. 42-17 is what I'm picking. Part of me is tempted to say 42-20, 42-24. The game won't get any more. the margin of victory for Ohio State will likely not be larger than this, I don't think, because it's week 1. Notre Dame is going to come out and they're going to do something. They're going to be competitive at least for a bit. This isn't going to be like Ohio State versus Michigan State last year. People sometimes like to think that's more common for games to be that lopsided, but that isn't always the case. It just isn't. Notre Dame has to test the run game if they want to win. They have to not just test the run game, but they have to do well on the offensive line. They have to play as if Jarrett Patterson wasn't injured, which is going to be pretty close to impossible, but it can be done. It can be done. There's nothing impossible in the world of college football. Tight end Michael Mayer should do great. They should target him all game. They should target him because Steele Chambers and Tommy Eichenberg, they're good players. I respect them. They're Big Ten players. They're not going to be able to lock down Michael Mayer. They're not going to. He's too good of a tight end. Tyler Buckner and Drew Pine, Buckner's starting. They're not CJ Stroud. Notre Dame's wide receivers aren't Ohio State's wide receivers. So while Notre Dame should test that medium to deep passing game, they should target their wide receivers. They also should go with what they do best, and that's trench play, and that's chucking it to their tight end. They're All-American, I believe, or close to All-American tight end, if I'm not mistaken. And defensively, this will be Notre Dame's worst. And by that, I mean this is going to be the best offense Notre Dame will face all year by a mile. Period. Amen. They'll face BYU, who's a good offensive team. They come nowhere close to Ohio State's elite offense. And Clemson, who's their other toughest game this season. Clemson's going to be tough defensively to crack. They're not going to be tough offensively to crack, in my opinion, because of their issues at offensive line and wide receivers. So defensively, if Notre Dame locks down Ohio State, either Ohio State's going to continue to regress in the Ryan Day era, or this was maybe a very fluke game, but more likely than not, if Notre Dame wins this game, their defense will be one of the best in the country, because this is their defense's toughest test all year. So Ohio State 42, Notre Dame 17. I think the Buckeyes are going to show they're the number 1 team in the nation. And that's all I have to say for this video. If you're a fan of the channel, and you've been watching for a while, or even if you're new but you haven't hit that subscribe button, I encourage you to do so. Hit that subscribe button, like up this video, share it around, click the notification bell, and comment your thoughts on this matchup down below. Again, I'm sorry for the background noise, and I'm sorry that this video was posted late, but that's what happens when you're a college student and your schedule gets busy. So hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you're following or listening to this on Spotify, make sure to follow the channel. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys around. Bye.